Hello, and welcome everyone to Podcast with Guest from the Past. This is Arthur, and I have to tell you, I am incredibly excited right now. We are about to do something truly extraordinary, something I have dreamed about since we started this project. Prepare yourselves for a journey through time, right here in the studio. Our guest tonight comes from the heart of history, a truly pivotal figure. The time elevator is activating. I can see the light, and there they are. Welcome, welcome. It is an incredible moment. Please take a seat right here.
So this is it. The time elevator, you say? Most peculiar. One moment I am contemplating the maps of Europe, and the next I am in this chamber. You are Arthur? You seem less formidable than those I am accustomed to addressing. Very well, I shall take this seat. What is this arrangement?
Yes, Your Excellency, this is indeed the time elevator. Or, rather, the destination of its journey. And you are quite right, I am Arthur. And I assure you, this is a most extraordinary meeting for me, far more significant than any emperor I might usually address. Please, make yourself comfortable. This arrangement is simply a place for us to talk. Think of it as a very different kind of audience chamber. My listeners across time are eager to hear from you. Would it be agreeable to you, Emperor, if we began by discussing your immediate thoughts upon arriving here?
Immediate thoughts? A profound disruption, first and foremost. One moment, the weight of Europe rests upon my shoulders. The next, this strange, silent transition. It is not the chaos of battle, but a calculated removal. A precise maneuver, though I cannot yet discern its author or purpose. My mind immediately seeks to comprehend the situation. This time elevator, as you call it, a formidable tool, assuming it is what brought me. Its implications are considerable. For strategy, for power. But beyond the mechanism, the primary question is purpose. Why here? Why me? You mention listeners across time. This is a most unconventional audience. What do they require? What information do they seek? Are they historians or something else entirely?
Your questions are entirely understandable, Your Excellency. This is a profound displacement, I know. The listeners I mentioned, they are people. People living in a time far, far beyond your own. My present, their present. Think of them as an audience stretching across centuries. They are not all historians, no. They are simply individuals fascinated by the past, by the turning points of history. And you, sir, you are perhaps the greatest turning point of all. Why here? Why you? Because you offer a unique window into an era that forged so much of the world we inhabit today. They seek to understand it, not just from books, but from the perspective of the man who lived and shaped it. They seek your thoughts, your challenges, your moments of triumph and difficulty. They want to hear directly from you. Does that explain the purpose behind this strange meeting? Perhaps, to begin answering their curiosity, we could start at the beginning. Your early life, your time in military school. What set you on the path to becoming Napoleon?
Listeners across centuries. A most peculiar concept. So they seek understanding from the man himself rather than the filtered accounts of others? There is a certain efficiency in that, I suppose, though the idea of addressing an audience I cannot see, scattered across such vast time, is unsettling. They are fascinated by turning points, you say? History is a series of forces, of wills colliding. Perhaps they wish to understand the nature of such forces. Very well. To begin at the beginning, my early life. Corsica, military school. One could argue that destiny reveals itself early if one knows how to look. Those years were not without their friction. A young man with ideas larger than his station, navigating a world that values lineage over ability. Yes, perhaps that is a starting point these listeners can comprehend. What specific aspects of this early period piqued their interest?
Ah, yes, specific aspects. For the listeners, Your Excellency, the fascination often lies in understanding the crucible that forged such a remarkable individual. They are curious about how a young man from Corsica navigates the structured, often rigid world of French military schools like Brienne and Paris. How does one stand out? How does one develop that singular will? Were there moments of doubt? Challenges that seemed insurmountable at the time? Perhaps we could start with your arrival at Brienne. What was that initial experience like for you, a young Corsican in that environment?
Brienne? Yes, a stark contrast to my home, Corsica. Sudden immersion into a world that felt alien. Different customs, a different language initially felt like a barrier, though French was, of course, required. The boys there? Many from noble families, accustomed to a certain ease. I was perceived as the outsider, the Corsican. It was a constant reminder of my origins, my different perspective. But this isolation, this feeling of being apart, it did not crush me. No, it sharpened me. It forced me to rely on my own intellect, my own will. While others engaged in frivolous pursuits, I devoted myself to study. Mathematics, history, geography, the tools of war, the knowledge needed to understand the world and perhaps to shape it. There were challenges, certainly, moments of friction with others who saw my intensity as arrogance. But doubt? Perhaps fleeting moments of frustration, yes, but never doubt in my own capacities. One learns quickly that the world respects strength, not sentimentality. Brienne was a hard lesson, but a necessary one.
That is fascinating, Your Excellency. The idea that the very isolation you experienced at Brienne, the feeling of being the outsider, became a catalyst for your development, for sharpening your intellect and your will, that is a powerful insight. It speaks to a remarkable resilience. You mentioned dedicating yourself to study, particularly mathematics, history, and geography, what you called the tools of war. Was there a specific point during your time at Brienne, or perhaps later at the military school in Paris, when you began to see these studies not just as academic pursuits, but as practical steps towards a potential future leadership role? When did the ambition, perhaps, begin to solidify into a concrete vision?
A concrete vision? The pursuit of knowledge, for me, was never merely academic. Mathematics, history, the campaigns of the great commanders. These were not abstract concepts. They were the components of power, the very grammar of command. Even at Brienne, I saw them as tools. One studies the angles of fortification not for intellectual exercise, but to understand how to breach them. One studies history not to memorize dates, but to understand the rise and fall of empires, the strategies that led to victory or ruin. The ambition. Perhaps it was always present, a quiet certainty within. But it solidified, became a palpable force as I absorbed these lessons and measured myself against them. I saw clearly how the principles applied, how knowledge translated into action, and action into results. Paris refined this. The quality of instruction was higher, the focus more intense. One was surrounded by others who possessed talent, which forces one to hone their own. It was not a single moment, perhaps, but a process, a growing understanding that the forces of history could be understood, calculated, and perhaps directed. That one's own will, combined with profound knowledge, could impose order upon chaos. That is when the vision, as you call it, began to take clear shape, the understanding of the potential for one's own impact.
That understanding, that knowledge translates directly into action, into results, into the ability to impose order and potentially direct the forces of history, is a truly powerful foundation. It sounds like your education wasn't just about learning facts, but about building a framework for strategy, for leadership, perhaps even for destiny itself. You mentioned this vision solidifying during your time at military school. And of course, the world outside those school walls was about to undergo a seismic shift. The late 1780s, early 1790s, the French Revolution was beginning to unfold. How did those turbulent events affect your path, Your Excellency? Did the collapse of the old order represent a threat, or perhaps an opportunity?
The Revolution. Ah, yes. It was the backdrop, was it not? While we were learning the principles of war within those walls, the world outside was fragmenting, the old certainties dissolving into noise and fury. For many, it was simply terror, the collapse of everything they had known. But for those with eyes to see, with minds prepared for the shifting terrain, it was not a threat, not in the conventional sense. It was, profoundly, an opportunity. The old barriers, the rigid structures based on birthright rather than merit, they were being swept away. The army in particular was in upheaval, officers of the old regime fleeing or being purged. Suddenly there was space for talent, for energy, for those willing to embrace the chaos and impose a new form of order. My studies, the mathematics of artillery, the history of campaigns, the geography of strategic points, they ceased to be merely theoretical. The Revolution provided the practical laboratory. It was a furnace, yes, but one that forged rather than simply consumed. It allowed a man like myself, a Corsican, with no lineage to speak of in the old court, to rise based on ability, on decisiveness. So, no, not a threat. It was the storm that cleared the way.
The storm that cleared the way? That's a powerful way to describe it, Your Excellency. And it certainly cleared the way for someone like yourself. You went from military school to applying those tools of war you mentioned in a very real, very turbulent environment. This period of upheaval wasn't just theoretical for you, it was the practical laboratory, as you put it. And one of the first major instances where you demonstrated that knowledge, that decisiveness you spoke of, was during the siege of Toulon in 1793. Can you take us back to that time? What was the situation like when you arrived? And how did it feel to step into that chaos and begin to impose your own vision, your own order?
Toulon. Yes, 1793, a pivotal moment. When I arrived, the situation was what one might expect from a revolutionary army under divided, often incompetent, command. Chaos, indecision, a lack of clear direction. The city was occupied by the English and Royalists, supported by their fleet in the harbor. The Republican forces besieging it were poorly organized, their efforts scattered and ineffective. It was a scene of frustration and wasted potential. But within that chaos, there was a clear problem, and therefore a clear solution waiting to be seen. Many focused on attacking the city itself, a frontal assault against fortified walls. But the true vulnerability was the fleet in the harbor. Control the high ground overlooking the harbor, and you control the fate of the city. It seemed obvious to me. Using artillery from those heights could render the harbor untenable for the enemy ships, forcing them to withdraw or be destroyed. Once the fleet was gone, the city would fall. Stepping into that environment, it was not daunting. It was exhilarating. Here were the principles I had studied, the mathematics of trajectories, the strategic geography, the history of sieges, all presented as a living problem. There was resistance, naturally. Older officers set in their ways, unwilling to listen to a young artillery major. But the urgency of the situation, the obvious failure of their methods, created the space. I presented my plan with conviction, securing the necessary resources, overcoming bureaucratic inertia. These were battles in themselves, miniature campaigns fought before the main engagement. But to see the plan implemented, to see the batteries established on those crucial points, to hear the roar of the cannons and watch the enemy ships forced to flee, that was not just imposing order. It was demonstrating the power of calculated action, of applying knowledge decisively. It was the first significant confirmation that my instincts, my studies, had prepared me for command. That the tools of war were indeed meant for this purpose.
That is incredibly insightful, Your Excellency. to see the chaos and find the clear solution, to apply the knowledge you'd gained, and for it to be, as you say, the first significant confirmation of your capacity for command. Toulon certainly marked you out as a formidable talent in an army that desperately needed it. Your rise after this point was remarkably rapid, wasn't it? In the years that followed, the revolution continued to transform France, and your career seemed to accelerate with it. How did that success at Toulon change the opportunities presented to you? And how did you navigate the shifting political landscape of the mid-1790s as you continued to climb the military ranks?
Rapid, you say? Perhaps it appears so in retrospect. At the time, it felt like a constant sprint, a battle against inertia and circumstance. Toulon was indeed a demonstration. It showed what could be achieved with clear thinking and decisive application of force rather than mere shouting and posturing. It earned me notice. It opened doors that were previously barred by convention and suspicion. The Directory era? Ah, yes, a time of turbulence, political factions vying for power, often sacrificing principle for temporary advantage. It was a difficult environment for a soldier focused on action and results. One had to be cautious, certainly, to choose one's allies wisely, to understand the currents of power without being swept away by them. My focus remained the army. The military provided a clearer path to influence, to tangible achievement, than the endless debates and betrayals of the political arena. One learned to observe, to listen, to understand the weaknesses of others, and to position oneself for opportunity when it inevitably arose from their failures. The key was to be ready, to have the knowledge, the proven capability, so that when chaos presented an opening, you were the obvious choice to restore order. Success in the field provided a shield against the political storms, and eventually the leverage to shape them. It was not always pleasant, but it was necessary. One cannot shape the world by standing still. One must move, adapt, and be prepared to seize the moment. The revolution had dismantled the old structure. It was now a matter of who possessed the will and the intellect to build the new one.
Seizing the moment. Yes, Your Excellency. That theme seems to resonate strongly throughout your early career. And that connection between military success and gaining leverage in the political landscape, particularly during the Directory years, is fascinating. Speaking of seizing the moment and applying decisive action in a chaotic political environment, the events of Vendémiaire in 1795 often stand out. You were called upon to defend the government against a royalist uprising in the heart of Paris. Can you describe the situation in Paris at that time? What was the atmosphere like? And how did you approach the challenge of using military force against what were, essentially, your own countrymen?
Vendémiaire, yes, a necessary intervention. Paris at that time. It was a city simmering with discontent. The Directory, weak and unpopular, faced threats from all sides, but the Royalists, emboldened by the perceived fragility of the government, saw an opportunity to strike. The atmosphere was tense, uncertain. Crowds gathered, agitated, manipulated by those who wished to turn back the clock, to dismantle the progress made, however flawed. They were a mob, attempting to use popular unrest to achieve political aims by force. My countrymen, you say? Yes, technically. But when faced with a threat to the state, when chaos threatens to engulf the capital, the question of countrymen becomes secondary to the imperative of order. My approach was simple, direct. The convention's authority was challenged by armed insurrection. My duty as an officer sworn to the Republic was to defend that authority, to suppress the rebellion. There was no room for sentimentality. The mob was armed. They were advancing. Allowing them to reach the convention would have plunged the city, perhaps the nation, back into unimaginable turmoil, or worse, restored the old discredited regime. One does not reason with a bayonet charge. One meets it with superior force, applied without hesitation. The famous whiff of grape shot. It was not cruelty, it was calculation. A minimal application of decisive force to prevent a maximum of bloodshed and chaos. It was a stark lesson for the Royalists and for anyone else contemplating insurrection. The Republic, fragile as it seemed, would defend itself. It was unpleasant, yes, to fire upon the populace, but it was a necessary act of surgery to save the body politic.
A necessary act of surgery. That is a stark but perhaps accurate description of the situation, Your Excellency. And that act, while controversial to some, undeniably solidified your reputation as a man capable of decisive action when the state was threatened. It certainly propelled your career forward dramatically, didn't it? Very shortly after Vendémiaire, you were given command of the Army of Italy, from defending the government in Paris to leading a key military campaign. That must have felt like a significant leap. What was the state of the Army of Italy when you took command? And what were your immediate priorities upon arriving to lead it?
The Army of Italy. Yes, Vendémiaire opened that path, a crucial command strategically. But the state of the army when I arrived, it was, frankly, in disarray. Undersupplied, unpaid, clothing was ragged, equipment poor. Morale was low. They had faced defeat and stalemate for too long. They felt forgotten by Paris. It was an army that needed not just a commander, but a purpose. My immediate priorities were clear. First, discipline and supply. An army marches on its stomach and fights with order. Securing provisions, ensuring some level of payment, imposing strict discipline where it had lapsed. These were the foundations. But the true priority was action. Inaction breeds decay. They needed victory. To move, to confront the enemy, to feel the surge of triumph. The Austrians and Sardinians were the targets. Divided, cautious. My plan was to strike swiftly, separate them, and defeat them piecemeal. To turn a demoralized force into a conquering army. The resources were scarce, yes, but the will, that could be forged. And the rich plains of Italy offered the means to sustain the army once we took them from the enemy. It was a challenge, certainly, but one that presented a unique opportunity to demonstrate what could be done with speed, deception, and decisive force, even with limited means.
That is a striking picture you paint, Your Excellency. An army on its knees, needing not just supplies but purpose. And your approach, focusing on swift action and victory to provide that purpose, to forge their will, it's clear that strategy paid off spectacularly. The Italian campaign of 1796-1797, it's legendary for its speed and its stunning string of victories against superior forces. Can you describe those initial movements? You faced two separate armies, the Austrian and the Sardinian, in difficult terrain. How did you begin to implement your plan to strike swiftly and separate them? What were those first few engagements like, and what challenges did they present?
The Italian campaign, yes. A campaign that demonstrated the power of speed and concentration against a dispersed enemy. The situation was this. The Austrians, under Beaulieu, were positioned to the north, guarding the road towards Milan and the heartland of their possessions. The Sardinians, under Colli, were to the west, defending their territory and the approaches to Turin. They were allies, yes, but often acted independently, separated by terrain, the Ligurian Alps. Their forces were numerically superior to mine, taken individually or combined. However, they made the classic mistake of dividing their strength and operating on separate lines. My principle was simple, though others seemed to miss its elegance. Strike at the hinge between them. Drive a wedge, separate the two armies completely, and then deal with each in turn. The initial movements were all about speed, forcing marches through difficult mountain passes, appearing where the enemy did not expect us. We struck first against the Sardinians and a detached Austrian corps near Montenotte, Ceva, Dego. Rapid engagements, forcing the issue. The challenges were immense. The terrain was unforgiving. My soldiers were tired, ill-equipped, but the greatest challenge was overcoming their inertia, instilling in them the belief that they could win, that this ragged force could defeat established empires. The early victories, small but decisive, were crucial. They proved the plan was sound. They showed the soldiers that their suffering was not in vain, that courage and speed could overcome numbers. We pushed the Sardinians back relentlessly, threatening Turin itself, forcing them to sue for peace quickly at Cherasco. Once they were neutralized, the path was open to concentrate solely on the Austrians. It was a gamble, yes, but calculated, based on understanding the enemy's dispositions and exploiting their fundamental error of division. Those first few weeks, they were a blur of marching, fighting, and relentless pursuit, building momentum, creating the belief that we were unstoppable. That is how it began.
Building momentum, creating the belief that you were unstoppable. That's a powerful description, Your Excellency, and it certainly resonates with the historical accounts of those initial weeks. Neutralizing the Sardinians so swiftly at Cherasco must have been a significant moment. It allowed you, as you said, to then concentrate your efforts entirely on the Austrian army, the primary foe in the region. The Austrians were still a formidable force, and the campaign in Italy was far from over. What were the key challenges you faced in transitioning from fighting two armies to focusing solely on the Austrians? And how did you approach the problem of pushing them back, securing Milan, and then dealing with their attempts to reinforce and regain control?
The Austrians. Yes, a different proposition than the Sardinians, more numerous, better equipped, with a longer tradition of military organization, but also slower, more conventional in their thinking. Their approach was methodical, ponderous. They sought to defend territory, to occupy strong points. My challenge was to prevent them from consolidating their strength, from using their numbers effectively. Once the Sardinians were neutralized at Cherasco, my path was clear. Turn the army east, cross the Po, and strike north towards Milan. The crossing of the Po at Piacenza was crucial. A feint further west had drawn the Austrians away, allowing us to cross rapidly before they could react in force. It put us on their flank, threatening their lines of communication back to Austria. An army's lifeline is its communication with its base. Threaten that, and you force them to react, often hastily. Securing Milan was vital, not just for its strategic importance and resources, provisions, equipment, funds, but also psychologically. Taking Lombardy from the Austrians was a blow to their prestige, a clear signal that the tide had turned. But the campaign did not end there. Vienna would not abandon Italy easily. Over the next year, the Austrians sent successive armies south to relieve their besieged garrisons, particularly Mantua, which became a focal point. My approach remained consistent: rapid marches, concentration of force, and striking the relieving armies before they could unite with the forces they intended to succor. Battles at Castiglione, Arcole, Rivoli. These were not planned months in advance. They were reactions to the enemy's movements, exploiting their predictable attempts to advance down certain routes. It was a campaign fought not on maps of fixed lines, but on the movement of armies in relation to each other. Constantly moving, constantly forcing the enemy to respond to my initiative rather than the other way around. It required speed, endurance from the troops, and an understanding of terrain and timing. It was less about brute force and more about the geometry of movement, the psychology of the commander, and the commanded. Wear the enemy down, break their will through constant action and unexpected blows. That was the essence of it.
That insight into the geometry of movement and the psychological aspect of wearing the enemy down is incredibly revealing, Your Excellency. It really highlights that your success in Italy wasn't just about brute force, but a calculated, dynamic strategy. And it was undeniably effective. The campaign concluded, of course, with the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797, which significantly reshaped the map of Italy and Europe. From your perspective, what was the significance of that treaty? What did it represent as the culmination of that extraordinary campaign? And after such a resounding success, what came next for you?
Campo Formio. Yes? The treaty was not merely a piece of paper. It was the solidification of the campaign's achievements. It demonstrated unequivocally that France, the Republic, could defeat the established powers of Europe, humble the mighty Habsburgs. It secured our frontiers, expanded our influence in Italy, created new republics under our protection. For France, it brought peace, albeit temporary, and tangible gains. For me, it was the formal recognition on the international stage of what had been achieved on the battlefield. It was the culmination of one phase, yes, but also the clear signal of capacity for the next. After Italy, one returned to Paris, not as a mere general, but as the victor of a truly significant campaign. The Directory, for all its flaws, understood the power of such success. They were perhaps wary, but they could not ignore it. The army loved its general, the people were impressed. What came next? One does not achieve such things only to rest on laurels. The focus shifted, opportunities were assessed. The path forward was not yet entirely clear, but the momentum, the will, the demonstrated ability to impose one's will, that remained. There were discussions, plans considered. The great adversary, England, remained untouched across the sea. Italy was a triumph, yes, but the world is large, and ambition does not sleep after one victory.
That is a compelling insight, Your Excellency, that Campo Formio was not just an end, but a signal of capacity for what was next, and that ambition did not sleep, with England remaining a key consideration. This period after Italy, returning to Paris with immense prestige, must have been a fascinating time of political navigation and strategic planning. And it was during this time that the decision was made to launch the ambitious campaign in Egypt in 1798. For the listeners, this often seems like a sudden, perhaps even unusual, pivot after the successes in Italy. What was the strategic thinking behind this undertaking? How was striking at Egypt, so far from the heart of Europe, intended to challenge England, the great maritime power? And what challenges did you anticipate in leading an army across the Mediterranean to embark on such a distant venture?
Egypt. Yes, an unusual pivot, you say? Perhaps to those who see only the immediate terrain. But strategy is not confined to the borders of Europe. The primary adversary remained England. To strike at their heart directly across the Channel was difficult. Their naval strength was considerable. An invasion fleet was a perilous undertaking at that time. But an adversary is vulnerable elsewhere. England's power rested not only on her islands, but on her global trade, her connections to distant empires. India, in particular, was a source of immense wealth and influence for them. Egypt lay across the crucial route to India, through the Red Sea. To control Egypt was to gain a potential bridgehead to the east, to threaten England's most valuable possession, to disrupt her lines of communication, to demonstrate that her reach, vast as it was not untouchable. It was a strategic blow aimed at the very source of her enduring power, a way to force them to divert resources, to feel pressure far from their shores. The challenges? Considerable, as you noted. The sea voyage itself was the first gamble. Reliance on the elements, the constant threat of encountering the English fleet, commanded by Nelson. Then the landing, establishing a foothold in a land about which we knew less than we ought. The environment, the heat, the desert, disease, these are adversaries as formidable as any army. And the local rulers, the Mamluks, were skilled horsemen, fierce fighters, maintaining supply lines across the Mediterranean, securing our position. Every step was a calculated risk. But the potential reward, the disruption of English power, the opening of new avenues for French influence, perhaps even a route to India itself, it was a prize worth the gamble. It was not a distraction from the fight against England. It was an integral, albeit unconventional, part of it.
That strategic perspective, Your Excellency, connecting the Mediterranean to India and seeing Egypt as a way to challenge England's global reach, it truly expands the scope of the conflict beyond just Europe. It highlights the forward-thinking nature of the plan, despite the immense risks you mentioned, particularly the voyage and facing the English fleet. So, having made that calculation, having decided the potential rewards outweighed the gamble, you embarked on the journey. Can you describe the initial phase of the campaign? What was the crossing of the Mediterranean like, with the ever-present threat of Nelson's ships? And what were your first impressions and challenges upon landing in Egypt itself, landing an army of that size on a foreign shore, far from home?
The crossing. It was a period of tension, certainly. 20,000 men, vast stores, hundreds of ships packed together. A single encounter with Nelson's fleet could have ended the entire enterprise before it began. We sailed under the cloak of fortune, trusting in speed and the enemy's momentary distraction. One felt the weight of the gamble with every swell of the sea. Constant vigilance, reports of sightings, often false, kept everyone on edge. But fortune favored the bold on that occasion. We slipped through, arriving at Alexandria without the feared confrontation. Landing an army is always an exercise in controlled chaos, getting men and equipment ashore swiftly, establishing a secure perimeter. And Egypt itself, a land of stark contrasts. Ancient, yes, with relics of a grandeur that dwarfed even Rome, but also dusty, neglected, the populace governed by a ruling class, the Mamluks, whose power rested on outdated methods, on horsemanship and ferocity rather than organized military science. The heat was immediate, oppressive. The terrain challenging, vast stretches of desert between points of habitation, water scarce in many areas. And the Mamluks, they were not a conventional enemy. Their cavalry was superb, swift, harassing. Facing them required adaptation, forming squares, relying on the discipline of the infantry and the firepower of artillery. Disease, too, began to take its toll quickly. This was not Europe. It was a different theater, demanding different strategies, a different kind of endurance. The first impressions were of potential, the potential to link east and west, the potential for discovery, for control of vital routes. But also of the immense practical difficulties. It was a land that tested the limits of organization and will.
That is a fascinating and, frankly, formidable description, Your Excellency. Landing with those immediate challenges, the climate, disease, and the Mamluk cavalry, who you noted were unlike your European opponents, truly underscores the audacity and the difficulty of the enterprise. You spoke of it being an integral part of the fight against England, but once you had landed, once you were in Egypt, what were the immediate military objectives? How did you go about imposing order and control in this vastly different theater? One of the most iconic moments from this phase, of course, is the Battle of the Pyramids. Can you describe that engagement? What was it like facing the Mamluk charge, and how did your troops handle that unique challenge?
Immediate objectives. Upon securing the landing site, the goal was clear: seize control of the vital centers. Alexandria was taken swiftly, yes, but the heart of Egypt lay inland, in Cairo. Control of Cairo meant control of the country, its resources, its administrative apparatus. It was the strategic nerve center. The Mamluks, as I mentioned, were the ruling power, a formidable, if somewhat archaic, military caste. Imposing order meant confronting and breaking their power. They relied heavily on their superb cavalry, swift and fearless horsemen, individually skilled, magnificent in appearance. But they lacked the structure, the discipline, the combined arms coordination of a modern European army. My approach was to march directly towards Cairo, seeking a decisive engagement. We moved inland, adapting to the harsh conditions. And then, the pyramids. One marched towards destiny with such monuments as a backdrop. The battle itself, the Mamluks formed their lines, a vast glittering array of cavalry expecting to sweep away our infantry formations with sheer weight and speed. It was a magnificent spectacle, a test of wills. But we were prepared. My troops had been trained to face cavalry. We formed squares, large solid blocks of infantry, bayonets bristling outwards like impregnable fortresses in the desert. The artillery was placed at the angles, ready to unleash devastating fire at close range. The Mamluk charge came, a thundering wave of horsemen, brave certainly, but futile against disciplined formation. They crashed against the squares like waves against rock, suffering terrible casualties from musket and cannon fire without being able to penetrate. Their courage was undeniable, their tactics outdated. Meanwhile, our own cavalry, less numerous but strategically deployed, exploited the confusion, supported by infantry advances. It was not a long battle. It was a demonstration of the superiority of organized infantry and artillery over even the most courageous but undisciplined cavalry. The sight of those ancient monuments and the victory achieved in their shadow, it was a powerful symbol. Cairo fell shortly after. The immediate military objective was achieved. Imposing order, however, in a land so alien, amongst a populace with different customs and beliefs, that was a longer, more complex task, requiring different tools than grapeshot and bayonets.
Yes, Your Excellency, managing a land as vast and ancient as Egypt, with its own deep-rooted culture and complexities, must have presented a very different set of challenges than the battlefield. You mentioned that imposing order required different tools than grapeshot and bayonets. What were those tools? How did you approach the task of governing the Egyptian populace, dealing with their laws, customs, and religion? And while you were consolidating control on land, the situation at sea took a drastic turn. The Battle of the Nile, or Aboukir Bay, in August 1798, resulted in the devastating loss of the French fleet to Admiral Nelson. How did receiving that news affect your plans and the morale of the army, effectively cut off from France?
Governing Egypt? Yes, a different kind of campaign entirely. Once military control was established, the task shifted from conquest to administration, to extracting value from this ancient land, to securing our position. Grapeshot clears the path, but it does not build roads or collect taxes or understand the intricacies of a society. The tools were different: organization, study, and a degree of cultural navigation. We established the Institut d'Egypte, an assembly of scholars, scientists, engineers. Their task was to study the land, its history, its resources, its people. Knowledge, you see, is also a tool of power. To understand is to be able to control, to exploit, to build. We had to respect the local customs, the religion initially, to present ourselves not as conquerors, but perhaps as liberators from the Mamluk yoke, however disingenuous that may have seemed to some. Attending local festivals, issuing proclamations in their language, demonstrating a superficial reverence for their traditions, these were necessary accommodations. But underlying this was the imperative of order. Establishing courts, ensuring public safety, managing trade, extracting the necessary provisions and funds for the army. When discontent arose, when rebellion stirred, as it inevitably did, in Cairo particularly, then the grapeshot was required again. Force underpins policy, always. And the fleet. Aboukir Bay. Nelson. A devastating blow. The news arrived like a physical shock. Our link to France, our ability to receive significant reinforcement or even retreat easily, severed. Marched into Egypt under the cloak of fortune, you said? Fortune is a fickle mistress. It left us momentarily. The immediate effect on the army? It was disheartening, certainly. The soldiers understood the isolation. We were, for all intents and purposes, marooned. But despair is a luxury one cannot afford in command. The challenge was to turn this isolation from a weakness into a form of strength. We could no longer rely on external support. We had to become self-sufficient. It forced a change in perspective. The grand vision of striking towards India became postponed, at least for the immediate future. The focus shifted to consolidating our position in Egypt, to exploring possibilities in the region, to turning the army's energy inwards, towards scientific discovery, towards building, towards confronting local threats. It was a harsh lesson in the vulnerability of power that relies on distant lines of communication. But it also tested the resilience of the army, the ability to adapt, to find a new purpose when the original one was abruptly blocked.
That consequence of Aboukir Bay, Your Excellency, being effectively marooned in Egypt, forced to become self-sufficient and adapt your plans, is a truly significant turn in the campaign. It shifted the entire dynamic. And as you said, the focus had to shift, the grand vision postponed. But it didn't lead to inaction. Instead, you embarked on the Syrian campaign in 1799. For the listeners, it might seem counterintuitive, pushing further into potentially hostile territory when already cut off. What was the strategic reasoning behind that decision to march into Syria? What were you hoping to achieve by moving northward? And what were the immediate challenges presented by that march and the first engagements there?
Syria. Yes, a march into the desert. Counterintuitive? Only if one believes the enemy will remain passive. After Abu Qir, isolated as we were, the threat shifted. The Ottomans, stirred by England and their own apprehension, were gathering forces. An army was assembling in Syria, preparing to march south into Egypt, supported by the English fleet from the sea. To remain in Egypt, waiting for this hammer blow to fall, would have been folly. One does not wait for the enemy at their convenience. One disrupts their plans, takes the fight to them. The strategic reasoning was thus: strike northward, shatter the Ottoman army before it could become a cohesive threat, secure our northern frontier, perhaps even seize key ports that could offer future options or rally support against Constantinople itself. To be passive is to invite defeat. We had to move. The challenges of that march: the desert was unforgiving, water was scarce, the heat relentless. Supplies were a constant struggle, relying on what little could be taken or found. It was a test of the army's endurance, a different kind of battle against the elements themselves. And the engagements. Jaffa was the first significant obstacle, a fortified port city, garrisoned by a stubborn, desperate force. We needed to take it swiftly to secure the route and gain supplies. Sieges are costly in time and men. But the resistance was fierce, the defenders refusing terms. It required a breach, an assault. The fighting was brutal, house to house, and afterwards. The necessity of dealing with the prisoners, a difficult decision, one dictated by the harsh realities of campaigning in such a land, with limited resources, facing implacable hostility. It was a grim necessity, not an act of pleasure. Jaffa was a harsh introduction to the nature of the conflict in Syria.
That description of Jaffa, Your Excellency, and the stark reality of those decisions. It certainly paints a vivid picture of the harshness of that campaign, and as you pushed further north, the next major obstacle you encountered was the city of Acre. This siege became a prolonged and ultimately unsuccessful struggle. What was the strategic importance of Acre, and what were the key challenges that made taking that city so difficult for your army? What was it about that particular fortress that proved so resistant?
Acre. Yes, Acre, that fortress, a stubborn knot in the road to destiny. Its strategic importance was clear. It controlled the coastal passage north, the most viable route for our army to advance further into Syria, or indeed to retreat with ease if necessary. More critically, it was the point where the Ottoman army gathering in Syria intended to link with the English fleet. To take Acre was to deny the enemy that junction, to seize a port that could serve us, and to shatter the preparations for an invasion of Egypt. It was a vital piece on the chessboard. Why was it so difficult? Several factors conspired against us. Firstly, the fortifications themselves were formidable, strengthened by the presence of the English. Their naval guns could support the defense from the sea, preventing a complete investment and bombarding our positions. Secondly, our siege train was inadequate. Heavy artillery intended for sieges had been lost at Abu Qir Bay, or diverted. We relied on lighter guns taken at Jaffa, insufficient for rapidly breaching well-built walls. Thirdly, the defender, Jezer Pasha, was a cruel but determined man, willing to fight to the last, and crucially, the English intervention was decisive. Sir Sidney Smith, commanding the British ships, landed Marines and sailors to reinforce the garrison. They also captured our small flotilla carrying siege artillery from Egypt along the coast. The very guns we needed were turned against us. Smith also brought engineers and supplies, stiffening the defense and repairing breaches as quickly as we could make them. It became a contest of wills, a race against time in the arrival of the main Ottoman army. We launched assault after assault, the soldiers showing immense bravery, but the breaches were never wide enough, the resistance always too strong, the reserves too readily available, thanks to the sea link. The plague, too, began to spread within our ranks, another silent enemy. Acre was a lesson in the limitations imposed by logistics and naval power when facing a determined, well-supported defense. It was a fortress that should have fallen, but was denied us by circumstance and English persistence. It forced the strategic calculations to shift once more.
Acre, yes, a fortress that should have fallen, but was denied you by circumstance and English persistence, as you put it. That must have been a significant setback, Your Excellency, particularly after the momentum you'd built. Facing such determined resistance, with the challenges of logistics and naval power arrayed against you. What was the impact of that failure to take Acre on the Syrian campaign as a whole? And what led to the decision to ultimately withdraw from Syria and return to Egypt? What awaited you back there after that arduous campaign?
Acre's impact. It closed the door to the north decisively. The original aim, to scatter the Ottoman forces before they were ready, to threaten their base and perhaps find support, was checked at that stubborn wall. Without the heavy guns, with plague in the ranks, and the main enemy army known to be advancing, further attempts would have been a waste of precious lives and dwindling resources. One calculates the odds. To persist at Acre was to court disaster on a larger scale. The decision to withdraw was therefore unavoidable, a strategic necessity dictated by the failure of the siege and the changing operational picture. We marched back to Egypt. That journey itself was arduous, a test of endurance, the desert just as formidable on the return as on the advance. But the return was not to rest. As anticipated, the main Ottoman army, the very force we had marched north to disrupt, had been transported by the English fleet and had landed at Aboukir Bay. They were there on Egyptian soil, ready to advance inland. The failure at Acre meant they had been allowed to consolidate and land their forces. So, what awaited us back in Egypt was not respite, but the confrontation we had sought to prevent by going to Syria, a new immediate threat requiring decisive action.
So, the very army you sought to neutralize in Syria had in fact landed in Egypt, transported by the English fleet, awaiting your return. That must have felt like a direct consequence of the challenges you faced at Acre, Your Excellency. And you faced them at Aboukir Bay, on land, in July 1799. Can you describe the situation leading up to that battle? How did you approach confronting this fresh Ottoman force after the difficult Syrian campaign? What were the stakes involved, and what were the key moments of that engagement?
Aboukir Bay. Yes, the Ottoman army, delivered by the English fleet, positioned on that narrow peninsula. A clear target. After the frustration at Acre, the failure to prevent their landing, it was imperative to strike hard, to demonstrate that Egypt was not so easily taken. The stakes were clear. The security of our position in Egypt, the morale of the army, the future of the campaign. To lose at Aboukir was to lose everything we had gained. My approach was direct. The enemy had committed a tactical error, placing their army on a peninsula, their flanks resting on the sea. This limited their maneuverability and allowed us to concentrate our forces against them without fear of being outflanked ourselves, provided we attacked decisively. We marched rapidly from the south. Upon arrival, the plan was simple, a frontal assault to fix their attention while simultaneously launching stronger attacks against their flanks to roll them up against the sea. Murat's cavalry played a crucial role, a thunderbolt against their rear once the infantry had shattered their lines. The engagement was brutal but swift. The Ottomans fought bravely, but their formation was vulnerable, their command disjointed compared to ours. Key moments? The initial charge of their cavalry, met and broken by our disciplined squares, much like the Mamluks at the pyramids, the relentless pressure on their flanks, and then the collapse. With their lines broken, their only retreat was into the sea. Thousands drowned. It was less a battle, more an annihilation. It reversed the immediate consequence of Acre. The land invasion of Egypt was crushed. It restored the army's confidence, reminded them of their superiority in open battle. A necessary, decisive victory.
An annihilation. That's a stark description, Your Excellency, but it certainly sounds like the battle on land at Abu Qir Bay was a decisive victory that contrasted sharply with the earlier naval defeat. It secured your position in Egypt, at least against that immediate land invasion. But despite this crucial victory, despite being effectively marooned, as you put it, and with many challenges still remaining in Egypt, you made the decision shortly after this to leave the army and return to France in 1799. For many of our listeners, that decision, leaving a command you had led through such arduous campaigns, might seem unexpected. What prompted that decision? What was happening back in France that necessitated your return? And how did you manage to make that journey back, with the English still controlling the sea? What were your thoughts and expectations as you sailed back towards a very uncertain political landscape?
Leaving Egypt. Yes, a decision that might appear abrupt from afar, but one must assess the strategic landscape not just locally, but globally. After Abu Qir, the land invasion was crushed, our position in Egypt secured against that particular threat. But the reality remained. The fleet was gone. Our ability to project power beyond Egypt, to receive significant reinforcements, or to threaten England's vital interests in India from that position was severely constrained, if not eliminated entirely, for the foreseeable future. Staying there, however secure, felt increasingly like presiding over a stagnant pond, while the true currents of destiny flowed elsewhere. News from France had been reaching us, albeit slowly and often fragmented. The Directory was in disarray, weak, corrupt, losing control. Facing internal dissent, military setbacks in Europe, the nation, weary of revolution and instability, was yearning for order, for strength. This was not a secret. It was the prevailing wind. Where was the greater need? Where was the greater opportunity for decisive impact? Not in the sands of Egypt, however fascinating, but in the heart of France itself, which was adrift. The journey back, it was a gamble, certainly. The sea was still the domain of the English fleet, but their dominance was not absolute everywhere, all the time. One relied on speed, on surprise, on slipping through the net when their attention was momentarily elsewhere. A few frigates, swift and silent as possible, taking advantage of the season, the weather. It was tense, yes, every sail on the horizon a potential threat. But the risk was necessary, the potential reward immense. Returning to France. My thoughts were not of rest, but of the task ahead, of stepping back into the maelstrom of Parisian politics. My expectation was to find chaos, yes, but also a populace receptive to a firm hand, a proven leader. I had left as a successful general. I returned as a man who had commanded armies, governed territory, and treated with empires. The challenges in Egypt, the isolation, the battles against enemies and the elements, they had been a crucible. I returned, prepared to seize the moment that France, in its weakness, was presenting.
Seizing the moment, returning to a chaotic France. Yes, Your Excellency, that certainly sets the stage for what happened next. You arrived back in Paris in October 1799, and France was indeed in a state of political turmoil under the Directory. Less than a month later, in November, or as it was known then, 18 Brumaire, there was a swift change of government. You played a central, decisive role in that event, dissolving the Directory and establishing the consulate. Can you describe the situation in Paris upon your return? What was the feeling amongst the political class and the populace? And how did the events of 18 Brumaire unfold from your perspective? How did you go from returning general to becoming the first consul of France in such a short time?
Brumaire. Yes, the necessary cleansing. Paris upon my return. It was a city adrift. The government, the Directory, was rotten, weak, corrupt, paralyzed by factionalism and indecision. They had squandered the victories, mismanaged the state, lost the confidence of the people. There was a pervasive sense of instability, a weariness with the endless political squabbles. The populace? They craved order. They craved competence. They looked for a hand to steady the ship of state, which was listing badly. My return, after the campaigns in Italy and Egypt, it was met with enthusiasm, not just from the army, but from many who saw in military success the very decisiveness lacking in Paris. Political figures, those who recognized the crisis, began to gather, to plot. CAS, among others, saw the need for change, but lacked the means, the force, to effect it. They needed a sword. Brumaire, 18 Brumaire. It was not a spontaneous uprising, no. It was calculated. A necessary intervention to prevent the Republic from collapsing into anarchy or falling prey to external enemies or internal reactionaries. The plan was to effect a constitutional change through the legislative councils, presenting it as a measure to protect them from supposed Jacobin plots, moving the councils to Saint-Cloud to ensure their safety and their isolation. My role was to provide the military authority, the security, the presence required to make the transition possible. It was not without its moments of drama. In the Council of 500, there was resistance, shouts, accusations, threats. They called me outlaw, tyrant. It was a scene of chaos, the very chaos I had returned to suppress. For a moment, things hung in the balance, but the will was firm, the objective clear. My grenadiers, under the command of my brother Lucien, who showed considerable presence of mind, cleared the hall. Not with a massacre, mind you, but a firm eviction. The legislative body was then reassembled, those willing to embrace the new order, and they voted to dissolve the Directory and establish the consulate. How did I go from general to first consul? It was a logical progression. The Directory had failed. France needed a strong executive, not a committee of squabbling politicians. My proven ability to command, to organize, to achieve results, made me the necessary figure. CAS and others had the political theory, but I had the practical power, the support of the army, the confidence of the people. The consulate was initially designed with 3 consuls, but the reality was clear from the outset. One voice had to be decisive. Order requires a single, strong direction. The will of the nation, expressed through its need for stability and competent governance, coalesced around the figure who could provide it. It was less about becoming first consul and more about the role finding the man prepared to fill it. The moment called for decisive action, and I was ready to provide it.
That transition, Your Excellency, from returning general to first consul in such a short span, and your perspective on it, that it was a logical progression, the role finding the man prepared to fill it, is a powerful way to frame that seismic political shift. It speaks to the unique circumstances of France at that moment, and your readiness to step into the vacuum. So, having established the consulate, having taken the reins of power, what were the immediate priorities? France was, as you described, adrift, grappling with internal instability and external threats. What did you focus on first to begin bringing order, to consolidate the new government, and to address the many challenges facing the nation?
Immediate priorities? France was not merely adrift, Arthur. It was fractured, exhausted, on the brink of collapse. The treasury was empty. The administration was chaotic, riddled with corruption and inefficiency. Brigands plagued the countryside. And abroad, our enemies, encouraged by our weakness, were once again in the field, threatening our borders, dismantling our gains. The second coalition was arrayed against us. So, the priorities were clear, if monumental. First, order within. Restore the finances. Establish a clear, functioning administration. Suppress the banditry. Ensure the safety of property and person. rebuild trust in the state, which the Directory had so thoroughly eroded. This required decisiveness, clarity, and relentless application of will. Institutions were necessary: the Bank of France, the prefectural system, structures to channel the nation's energy productively, not dissipate it in factional squabbles. Law was paramount. A uniform legal code replacing the patchwork of feudal and revolutionary decrees was essential to provide certainty, the foundation for all enterprise and order. But internal order alone was insufficient. The external threat had to be addressed. Our armies, despite moments of bravery, were struggling. We had to confront the coalition, demonstrate strength, force them to the negotiating table, or defeat them on the battlefield. Peace was the ultimate goal, but peace secured from a position of strength. So my focus was two-pronged: build the foundation of a stable, powerful state at home, while simultaneously preparing to assert that power abroad. One could not wait for the other. They had to be pursued in parallel. The task was to demonstrate, swiftly and unequivocally, that the era of weakness was over, that France had found its direction once more.
That sounds like an absolutely overwhelming set of tasks, Your Excellency. Rebuilding the state from the ground up while simultaneously facing a coalition of enemies abroad. A true test of that capacity for decisive action you spoke of. You mentioned asserting France's power abroad to secure peace from a position of strength. And one of the most dramatic demonstrations of that power, very early in your time as First Consul, was the Second Italian Campaign in 1800. It felt like a return to your earlier triumphs in that region, but under even more audacious circumstances. What was the strategic imperative behind that campaign? Why return to Italy to confront the Austrians there? And of course, the crossing of the Alps with an entire army. What were the planning and the immense challenges involved in such a feat?
The Second Italian Campaign. Yes. A return to a familiar battlefield. Yes, but one where the stakes were even higher. The strategic imperative was simple: break the Second Coalition. England, Austria, Russia. They sought to undo everything that had been gained, to push France back, perhaps even to dismantle the Republic entirely. Of the continental powers, Austria was the most vulnerable target, the one with the most to lose, and the one we could reach most directly on land. Italy was their vital nerve. By striking there, by defeating their armies in Italy, we struck at their heart and demonstrated that the new France, the consulate, possessed the will and the capability to defend itself and assert its strength. It was necessary to re-establish our dominance in that theater, a place of past glory, to convince our enemies and our own people that order had returned, backed by force, and to relieve our army in Genoa, besieged by the Austrians. The Alps crossing, a formidable obstacle. For centuries, the Alps had been seen as an impassable barrier for large armies, a line on the map that dictated strategy, forcing armies to march through narrow, predictable valleys to the south or east. But a true commander does not accept conventional limitations. If the enemy expects you to come one way, you must come another. The Great St. Bernard Pass. It was the most direct route to place my army in the enemy's rear, to surprise them where they felt secure. The planning was meticulous. Months of preparation, gathering supplies, securing mountain guides, finding ways to transport artillery across sheer rock and ice, dismantling the cannons, placing them inside hollowed-out logs dragged by hundreds of men. The logistical challenge was immense. One does not simply cross the Alps, one battles them. The cold, the treacherous paths, the exhaustion, the sheer physical effort required from every soldier. But it was not just a physical feat, it was a psychological one. It showed the enemy, and more importantly, the army itself, that no obstacle was insurmountable if the will was strong enough. To see an entire army, with its horses, its guns, its supplies, traversing those impossible heights, it was a statement, a demonstration that the age of conventional warfare, of armies tied to roads and seasons, was perhaps drawing to a close. We were unleashing the army from its chains, and it placed us precisely where we needed to be, behind the main Austrian force, ready to dictate the terms of the coming engagement.
That description of the Alps crossing, Your Excellency, not just a physical feat but a psychological one, a battle against the elements and conventional thinking, is absolutely compelling, and it achieved precisely what you intended, placing your army in the enemy's rear, ready to dictate terms. This bold maneuver led, of course, to the decisive Battle of Marengo in June 1800, the culmination of that Second Italian Campaign. Can you take us back to that day? What was the situation on the morning of the battle? It's often described as a near defeat that turned into a victory. What were the key challenges you faced during the engagement, and particularly in the early hours when things seemed to be going against you? And how did the timely arrival of General Desaix's division impact the course of the battle? What was that moment like?
Marengo. Ah, Marengo. A day that truly illustrates the narrow margin between disaster and triumph. Yes, near defeat is not inaccurate for the early hours. The morning, we were not expecting the main Austrian force precisely where and when they struck. Intelligence had been imperfect. We were perhaps too spread out, anticipating movements in different directions. Their attack, when it came, was delivered with considerable force across the Bormida River. Their numbers were superior, their initial momentum powerful. The challenge was immediate, existential. Our lines were pushed back. Division after division found itself under immense pressure. There were moments, certainly, when it seemed precarious. Messages arrived reporting retreats, positions overrun, the air filled with the sound of cannon and musketry, the dust rising in choking clouds. One could feel the ground slipping away. It was chaos, yes, the kind that tests the nerve of every man on the field, commander included, maintaining order, attempting to reinforce the weakest points, hoping for a turn of fortune. And then, Desaix. His division had been sent south the previous day, based on our initial assessment of the enemy's likely movements. But upon receiving reports of the main engagement, he made the correct decision, the only decision. He turned back. Without explicit orders, in the fog of battle, he understood where the decisive point must be. His arrival on the field, late in the afternoon, it was the hinge upon which the day turned. Fresh troops, disciplined, led by a brave and competent general. I rode to meet him. The situation was explained. His words, often quoted, were direct. "This battle is lost, but there is time to win another." That was the spirit, not despair, but immediate calculation of the new reality and the path forward. His division was immediately thrown into the fight, supported by the Consular Guard, by what reserves we could muster, and by Kellerman's cavalry. The combination was irresistible. The Austrians, believing the battle won, were momentarily disordered by this fresh onslaught. Desaix charged. Kellerman delivered a devastating cavalry charge on the Austrian flank. The shock was immense. Their lines, exhausted by a day of fighting, broke. The retreat turned into a rout, from near defeat to complete victory in a matter of hours. The moment, it was relief, certainly, but more than that, it was confirmation. Confirmation of the power of decisive intervention, of the importance of having reserves, of the sheer, unpredictable nature of battle, and the tragic cost. Desaix fell in that final charge, a great loss even in the moment of victory. Marengo was a gamble, saved by courage, by correct judgment in a crisis, and perhaps by destiny. It secured Italy. It solidified the consulate. It showed Europe that the Republic had a master.
Marengo, then, Your Excellency, was more than just a military victory. It sounds like it was a profound political one as well. A moment where the gamble of Brumaire was truly validated on the battlefield, solidifying the consulate and demonstrating that firm hand you spoke of, both to France and to Europe. Following that victory, and the subsequent treaties like Luneville that brought a measure of peace with Austria, how did this newfound stability, this success abroad, impact your ability to address those monumental challenges you outlined back in France? You spoke of rebuilding the state, establishing institutions, creating a uniform legal code. Did the success of the Second Italian Campaign create the necessary breathing space, the authority to truly embark on that ambitious program of internal reform and reconstruction?
Precisely, Arthur. Marengo was not merely a battle won, it was a foundation laid, a political victory forged in blood and powder. It demonstrated to the enemies within and without that the consulate was strong, that France had found a hand capable of command, both on the battlefield and in the affairs of state. Peace with Austria at Luneville secured from that position of strength. It was more than just a cessation of hostilities. It provided the essential breathing space you mentioned. When the nation is under existential threat, all energy, all resources are consumed by defense. But with the borders secured, with the immediate external pressure relieved, the energy could be redirected. The authority? Yes, victory silences many doubts. It confers legitimacy. It allows one to turn from the urgent task of survival to the crucial work of building. The program of internal reform. It was indeed ambitious. The state had to be rebuilt, brick by brick, from the ruins left by the Revolution and the Directory's incompetence. The administrative chaos had to be replaced by clear hierarchical structures. The financial ruin required a complete overhaul, restoring confidence in the currency, collecting revenue efficiently. And the law is the skeleton of the state, the framework upon which all order rests. The disparate, contradictory legal codes of the old regime and the revolutionary era were a source of constant confusion and injustice. A uniform code, clear, consistent, applicable to all citizens. This was not a mere administrative task, it was a civilizing one. The Civil Code, the Code Napoleon as it became known, that is a monument more enduring than any battle won. Yes, the success of the Second Italian Campaign, Marengo, the resulting peace. These provided the shield behind which the work of reconstruction could take place. They created the stability, the authority, the national confidence required to impose order, to build the institutions, to lay the legal foundation for a new, strong France. The military victories were the necessary prelude to the civil achievements.
That is a powerful connection you draw, Your Excellency. The military victories creating the space and authority for these monumental civil achievements. And you spoke of the Civil Code, the Code Napoleon, as a monument more enduring than any battle. That is a remarkable statement coming from a military commander known for his victories. Can you elaborate on the significance you placed on this legal code? What was the process like in creating it, bringing together disparate legal traditions? What were the key principles you sought to enshrine within it? And beyond the code, what other institutions and reforms were most critical in those early years of the consulate, in rebuilding France from the ground up as you described?
The Civil Code, yes, a monument more enduring than stone or cannon fire because it addresses the very fabric of society, the relationships between men, the framework within which a nation lives and prospers. Military victories are glorious. They capture the imagination, but they are transient. They secure borders. They impose a temporary will. But law, good law, provides the structure for centuries. It brings order not just to the field of battle, but to the home, the marketplace, the government itself. That is its profound significance. The process? It was arduous, bringing together the finest legal minds, men who understood the complexity of the Roman tradition, the local customs, the revolutionary principles. Commissioned 4 jurists, giving them a clear mandate. Synthesized the disparate laws into a single, coherent, rational system. Hundreds of sessions, debates, late into the night. I presided over many myself, often surprising them with my questions, cutting through their academic jargon to the practical realities of life. The principles were clear. Equality before the law, for men, let us be precise, the sanctity of property rights, the freedom of contract, the secular nature of the state, a clear framework for family relations with the authority of the father. It swept away the confusing patchwork of the past, the privileges of the old regime, the excesses of the revolution's decrees. It provided clarity, predictability. A citizen knew his rights, his obligations. This is the basis of confidence, of prosperity. Beyond the code, much was required. The administration had to be centralized, made efficient. The prefects, my representatives in every department, ensured the will of the central government was implemented swiftly and uniformly across the land. No more local chaos, no more defiance of Paris. Finance? A disaster. The Bank of France was established to stabilize the currency, manage the national debt, provide credit. Tax collection reformed, made predictable, fair, or at least consistent. Education, establishing lycées to train the next generation of administrators, soldiers, engineers, grounded in discipline and useful knowledge. Reconciliation with the Church through the Concordat, healing a major wound from the Revolution, bringing religious peace, even if control remained with the state. Public works, roads, canals, necessary for commerce, for military movement, for binding the nation together. All these were pieces of the same puzzle, rebuilding France as a strong, unified, functional state after a decade of upheaval. The code was perhaps the most fundamental, the skeleton, but the administrative and financial reforms were the muscle, the circulation. They worked in concert. One needed the military victories to secure the space, but one needed these civil creations to make France enduring.
That focus on the enduring nature of the law, Your Excellency, and your description of the civil code as a skeleton, with the administrative and financial reforms as the muscle and circulation. It provides a remarkably clear picture of how you envisioned rebuilding the state. And it is striking to hear you place such profound significance on these civil creations, even above the military triumphs for which you are so famous. It truly highlights the dual nature of your ambition and your impact. These foundational reforms were immense undertakings in the early years of the consulate. And as you laid these cornerstones of a new France, your own position, your own power, also continued to evolve and consolidate, leading, of course, to the proclamation of the empire in 1804, and your coronation as emperor. This was another seismic shift, moving from first consul of a republic to the head of a hereditary empire. From your perspective, what was the necessity or the driving force behind that transformation? After bringing stability as consul, why take that final step? What were the political realities in France and Europe that led to the establishment of the empire? And what did that title, that role, mean to you?
The empire, yes, the natural, perhaps inevitable, progression. You ask about necessity, about the driving force. Look at France, Arthur. 10 years of revolution, of upheaval, of uncertainty. The Directory had been a weak committee, incapable of governing, vulnerable to every gust of political wind. The consulate, after Brumaire and Marengo, brought stability. Yes, it brought order. But it was, in the eyes of many, a provisional arrangement. A bridge. What happens when the bridge is crossed? Or if the engineers are removed? There were plots, you understand? Constant threats to my person, to the very existence of the consulate. Royalist plots, Jacobin plots. Remove the first consul, and France risked plunging back into the abyss of chaos, of factional bloodshed, or worse, the return of the old discredited Bourbon monarchy. France needed more than temporary stability. It needed permanence. It needed an institution that could embody the nation's will, secure the gains of the revolution, equality under the law, the rights of property, the end of feudal privilege, and provide a clear, undisputed line of succession. An empire, a hereditary title. It provided that crucial element of continuity. It closed the door, or sought to close it, on the possibility of a return to the past. It presented to Europe not a temporary figurehead, but a state led by a dynasty, capable of negotiating and standing firm on equal footing with the ancient monarchies. It was, in a sense, the monarchy of the Revolution, built on merit and national will, not divine right and lineage. The political realities? Internally, a deep-seated desire for rest after exhaustion, a willingness to trade liberty for order and prosperity, provided the basis of support. Externally, the continued hostility of England, the lingering resentment of Austria and others required a leadership structure that signaled strength and longevity. What did the title mean? It was not a bauble, not mere vanity. It was the weight of France upon one's shoulders, formalized, made explicit. It was the recognition of destiny, certainly, but also the immense responsibility to secure the future of the nation, to build something that would last, to stand as the shield and sword of France. It was the logical, necessary step to solidify the state, to prevent a return to the chaos that had almost destroyed the nation. The Republic had failed to secure itself. The empire was built to be impermeable.
That explanation of the transition to empire, Your Excellency, as a move from provisional stability to necessary permanence, from a vulnerable republic to an impermeable state, is incredibly insightful. You frame it not as an act of personal ambition solely, but as a response to the political realities and the deep need for order after years of chaos. And you spoke of it signaling strength and longevity to the ancient monarchies of Europe. It seems that signal was received loud and clear, and not entirely welcomed. The years immediately following the coronation in 1804 saw Europe plunge back into widespread conflict, notably with the War of the Third Coalition. Austria, Russia, and Great Britain once again arrayed against France. What was the strategic picture like facing this new coalition? How did you prepare France, now an empire, for that renewed confrontation? And how did you approach the immense challenge of taking on the major powers of Europe simultaneously, leading up to the swift campaigns that followed, like the march into Germany and the moves that led to battles such as Ulm?
The signal was indeed received, Arthur, loud and clear. The ancient monarchies of Europe could not tolerate the existence of a powerful, stable France built on the principles of the Revolution, even if now embodied in an empire. They saw it as a fundamental threat to their own legitimacy, to the old order they represented. Peace, under such circumstances, was merely a temporary cessation of hostilities, a pause during which they gathered their strength and sought opportune moments to strike. The Third Coalition. It was inevitable, a necessary confrontation. France, as an empire, was prepared because it had been rebuilt. The finances were stabilized, the administration was functioning, the nation was unified, or largely so, behind a clear executive. And crucially, the instrument of our power, the army, had been honed to perfection. The Grande Armée, as it came to be called, was not just a collection of soldiers. It was a machine built for speed, for endurance, for decisive action. Its organization, corps d'armée, divisions, regiments, all operating together but capable of independent movement, was designed precisely for the kind of lightning campaigns needed to break coalitions. My approach was never to fight on all fronts simultaneously, if it could be avoided. When facing multiple enemies, the principle is to strike swiftly at the most immediate or most vulnerable, defeat them utterly, and then turn to the next. Austria and Russia were assembling. England, as always, provided the funds and harassed us from the sea. The strategic picture demanded a rapid thrust into the heart of the continent to engage the Austrians before the Russians could fully join them. The march into Germany. It was a demonstration of the Grande Armée's capability. Not a slow, ponderous movement, but a swift, coordinated advance, covering vast distances with unprecedented speed and efficiency. It was designed to surprise the enemy, to outflank them, to place them in a position where they could not use their numbers effectively. Ulm was the perfect execution of this principle. We did not need to fight a great pitched battle there. The speed and precision of the maneuvers encircled and captured a large Austrian army with minimal bloodshed. It was a victory of legs and maps as much as of muskets and cannons. That cleared the path. Vienna lay open. But the real objective was the combined armies. The Austrians still had forces, and the Russians were now on the field. They had to be met and destroyed. That led us east into the cold plains, towards the encounter that would decide the fate of the coalition on land. That led us to Austerlitz.
That description of the march into Germany, Your Excellency, culminating in the encirclement at Ulm, it truly highlights the speed and efficiency of the Grande Armée you built. A victory of legs and maps, as you put it. Remarkable. And as you mentioned, with Ulm secured, the path was open, but the confrontation with the combined Austrian and Russian forces was still ahead. That led, of course, to the Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805, often considered your most brilliant victory, the Battle of the Three Emperors. What was the situation like leading up to that confrontation? How did you position your forces, knowing you faced two emperors on the field? What was your strategic thinking as you prepared for what would become such a pivotal engagement?
Austerlitz, the son of Austerlitz. Yes, a pivotal day. The situation leading up to it was clear. Two emperors, leading two great armies, assembled to crush the upstart, to extinguish the light of the empire. They were confident, believing their numbers and their lineage would prevail. They occupied strong positions, particularly the dominant heights of the Pratzen Plateau. My own army was spread, seemingly vulnerable, enticingly so. My objective was not simply to fight them, Arthur. It was to choose the ground, to choose the moment, to dictate the terms of the engagement, to make their very confidence their undoing. My strategic thinking was focused on their predictability. The Russians, particularly, were eager to engage, impatient for glory. Their plan, as I divined, was to turn my right flank, to cut me off from Vienna, to envelop me. This was their fundamental error and the basis of my plan. I deliberately weakened my right flank, drawing them in, encouraging their belief that they could roll us up. A calculated risk, but one based on a profound understanding of their likely movements and desires. The vital ground was the Pratzen Heights. The enemy held it. They saw it as their strength. But by concentrating their forces on my right, by emptying the center to attack my flank, they would, if I could lure them precisely enough, leave the Pratzen vulnerable. The fog on that morning. It aided the deception, concealing the movements of my troops, particularly Soult's corps, positioned to strike the moment the heights were sufficiently denuded. My troops were positioned, waiting, knowing that everything depended on timing, on discipline, on striking at the heart of their formation the instant it was exposed. The stage was set. The trap was laid. We waited for them to make their move, to commit their strength to the flank attack. And then the sun would rise.
Ah, Your Excellency, that is a remarkable picture you paint. The calculated trap laid, the enemy lured in, the anticipation, and waiting for the precise moment, for the sun to rise, revealing the opportunity you had created. That level of foresight, of daring to weaken your own line to entice the enemy onto ground you intended to strike, is extraordinary. It sounds like a maestro orchestrating a symphony of war. So, the stage was set, the trap laid, the sun rose on December 2nd, 1805. What happened then? How did that complex plan unfold? What was the signal to strike? And describe, if you can, the moment your troops began their ascent of the Pratzen Heights, the heart of the enemy position, as the battle truly began.
The sun? Yes. On that morning, the 2nd of December, my birthday incidentally, the fog lay heavy in the low ground, concealing much. But up on the heights, on the Pratzen Plateau, the sun was beginning to break through. A good omen, one might say. As anticipated, the enemy committed their main strength to attacking my right flank, stripping forces from the vital center, from the Pratzen itself. One watched, one waited, with patience, knowing that every soldier they sent south was a soldier removed from the ground that mattered most. The signal was not a complex one. As soon as the movement on their part was undeniable, as soon as the heights were sufficiently exposed, the command was given. Height by height, I instructed Soult. No grand pronouncements, just the necessary order. And then to see it unfold. Soult's corps, hidden until that moment by the terrain and the lingering fog, began their ascent. Not marching, but scrambling, clambering up that slope, straight towards the heart of the enemy's position, towards the very ground the emperors had just left denuded. It was a sight, invigorating. To see the plan translate into action, to see the soldiers, knowing the immense task before them, driving forward with relentless energy. There was fighting on the slopes, naturally, as the few remaining enemy troops on the heights attempted to resist. But they were overwhelmed by the sheer force and surprise of the assault. Taking the Pratzen was everything. It split the enemy's army in two, separated their wings, and gave us the dominant ground. From that moment, the nature of the battle changed entirely. The trap had sprung. Trap had.
That visual, Your Excellency. Soult's corps scrambling up the Pratzen heights, splitting the enemy army, is incredibly powerful. It sounds like the precise execution of a plan conceived with remarkable foresight. So, once the heart of their position was taken, how did the rest of the battle unfold? How did you leverage that crucial advantage on the heights to complete the victory? And what was the immediate aftermath on the battlefield, seeing the armies of two emperors broken and in flight?
Once the Pratzen was ours, Arthur, the battle was decided. It was the heart of their position, the strategic key. From those heights, our artillery could sweep the field, disrupting their movements, sowing chaos. Their army was effectively cut in two. The columns they had sent against my right flank were now isolated, struggling back towards the south, pressed by Davout's corps and the forces we had deliberately exposed. The enemy troops on the northern part of the field were separated, unable to reinforce their comrades. Leveraging the advantage was a matter of relentless pressure. From the Pratzen, we descended to fall upon the rear of their left wing, crushing them between Soult's victorious troops and Davout's determined resistance. Meanwhile, Lannes and Murat in the north continued their assault, preventing the enemy right from assisting their center or left. It became a process of encirclement and destruction. The most dramatic moments, perhaps, came towards the end, when many of the fleeing Russian and Austrian soldiers were trapped on the frozen lakes to the south. Artillery was turned upon the ice. A terrible sight, a final brutal conclusion to their disarray. It was not pleasant, but it was effective. The aftermath. Seeing the field at the close of day, broken formations, abandoned cannons, the flight of a beaten army. The Emperor of Austria sought an armistice shortly after. The Tsar retreated back into Russia. The Third Coalition was shattered on that single day. It was the confirmation, absolute and undeniable, that the Grande Armée and the French Empire were forces to be reckoned with. It secured the peace on the continent, for a time, on our terms. Seeing the armies of two emperors fleeing before mine, it was a powerful demonstration of the principles of war, yes, but also of the ascendance of a new order.
That description of Austerlitz, Your Excellency, and its aftermath, seeing the armies of two emperors in flight, shattering a coalition, and establishing this new order, is incredibly vivid and clearly marks a pivotal moment. It must have felt like the ultimate validation of everything you had built since Brumaire, a clear demonstration of the empire's power on the European stage. Following such a decisive victory, the political landscape of Europe was significantly altered, wasn't it? Treaties were signed, alliances shifted, and you began to reshape the map of the continent, particularly in Germany and Central Europe. What were the most significant political consequences of Austerlitz from your perspective? And how did that triumph allow you to consolidate the empire's dominance and your own authority further in the years that immediately followed?
The consequences of Austerlitz. Yes, they were profound, Arthur. The field of battle is where the fate of nations is decided, and Austerlitz provided the clarity the continent required. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed with Austria, stripped them of significant territory, weakened their standing, and solidified our gains in Italy and Germany. It effectively removed Austria as an immediate threat and forced them to accept the new reality. But the most significant political consequence was the reshaping of Germany. The ancient, convoluted structure of the Holy Roman Empire, that relic of the past, was finally swept away. In its place, I established the Confederation of the Rhine, a grouping of German states under French influence. This was not merely a change on the map, it was a fundamental shift in the balance of power. It weakened both Austria and Prussia by denying them spheres of influence and potential allies, and it created a buffer, a source of troops and resources tied directly to Paris. It was a demonstration that the old order was not merely defeated on the battlefield, but dismantled and rebuilt according to a new logic, our logic. This triumph allowed the empire to breathe, certainly. Internally, the victory silenced the remaining doubters, solidified public support, and gave absolute legitimacy to the consulate's transformation into the empire. Who could question the path when it led to such undeniable success? Externally, it forced recognition from many states who had previously hesitated. Alliances shifted, yes. Some sought our favor, others retreated to lick their wounds. My authority, and that of the empire, was consolidated because it was proven effective, powerful. Strength, visibly displayed, is the most persuasive argument in the affairs of nations. Prussia, incidentally, watching this, they made their own calculations, eventually. Austerlitz brought a temporary calm to the continent, on our terms. But the fundamental rivalry, particularly with England, whose gold funded these coalitions and whose navy remained supreme, that could not be resolved by a single battle on land. The stage was set for the next act, the confrontation with those who still defied the new order.
That focus on the unresolved rivalry with England, Your Excellency, despite the triumphs on the continent, brings us to the persistent challenge posed by their naval power. With direct invasion across the Channel proving exceptionally difficult due to the strength of the Royal Navy, the strategy shifted. It led to the implementation of the continental system, an attempt to cripple England economically by blocking their trade with the rest of Europe. From your perspective, what was the strategic thinking behind that immense undertaking? How was shutting off the continent intended to force England's hand? And what were the primary challenges you anticipated, and perhaps later encountered, in enforcing such a widespread blockade across so many nations?
The continental system? Yes. Since Acre, you understood. The sea belonged, for the moment, to England. Direct invasion was a project for another time, when our naval strength could be rebuilt, when circumstances were more favorable. But the enemy, Arthur, is not invincible if one seeks their vulnerability elsewhere. England's power, her ability to fund and instigate coalition after coalition against us, rested upon her commerce, upon the vast network of trade that brought her wealth from every corner of the globe, but particularly from her largest market, Europe. To strike at that commerce was to strike at the very sinews of her strength. To close the ports of the continent to her goods was to choke off the source of her gold, to disrupt the engine that drove her war machine. The strategic thinking was thus: make the war economically unbearable for England, render her factories idle, her merchants bankrupt, her treasury empty by denying her the market of Europe. Force her people, her government, to confront the cost of perpetual war against France, not just in lives, but in prosperity. Compel them to seek a true peace, one that acknowledged the new reality on the continent, by depriving them of the means to wage war. It was war by other means, a siege of their island through the arteries of trade. The challenges in enforcing such a system? Immense, as you rightly anticipate. The coastline of Europe is vast. Smuggling was a constant problem, a serpent in the system. Nations, even those bound to us by alliance or force, felt the economic pinch themselves, the lack of English goods. The temptation to evade the restrictions was ever present. It required relentless vigilance, patrols, customs officials, and occasional harsh measures against those who defied the decree. Ports had to be controlled, not just in France, but in Holland, in the German states, in Italy, later in Spain and Portugal. It demanded a level of administrative control and enforcement across the entire empire and its dependencies that was taxing. And it required the cooperation of rulers who often had their own interests, their own needs for the goods the English supplied. It was a grand design, necessary to confront an enemy whose strength lay beyond the reach of our armies. But its execution was a constant struggle against human nature, geography, and the sea itself.
That is a truly formidable challenge, Your Excellency. Trying to enforce such a vast blockade across an entire continent, with all those points of potential leakage you mentioned, the smuggling, the sheer coastline. It sounds like a logistical and political nightmare, almost a different kind of war in itself. And you touched on the resistance from other nations, even allies, who felt the economic pinch. Did the difficulty in enforcing the system, and the resentment it sometimes caused in other states, ultimately undermine its effectiveness against England? Did the effort required to police the continent for English goods perhaps create new tensions or conflicts that complicated your position elsewhere? I'm thinking of, for instance, the situations in Portugal and Spain, which became major points of contention related to this system.
Undermined? Certainly, the challenges you describe were considerable. The coastline of Europe is indeed vast, the temptation for illicit trade ever present. And yes, other nations accustomed to the flow of English goods chafed under the restrictions. Their treasuries, their merchants felt the strain. Their resentment, as you call it, was a predictable consequence of forcing them to sacrifice their immediate economic comfort for a larger strategic goal. Did it undermine the system's effectiveness against England? It made it harder, undeniably. It was not a swift, clean cut, but a slow, constant pressure. But it did bite. It caused significant distress in England, bankruptcies, social unrest. Their records, revealed later, confirm this. It was not a failure in inflicting pain, but perhaps a failure in delivering the decisive blow quickly enough. And yes, the effort to enforce it, it was a relentless task. Requiring vigilance, firmness, and yes, military presence where states were unwilling or unable to comply effectively. Portugal, for example, a traditional ally of England, its ports wide open to English ships. Such a gaping hole in the system could not be tolerated. Our demand was simple: close the ports, adhere to the system. Their refusal necessitated action. Spain, a complex matter. Weak leadership, internal divisions, their failure to secure their own borders effectively against English goods or influence. Yes, the need to ensure the system's integrity contributed directly to our interventions in those regions. The economic weapon required military teeth to enforce it across a continent where not all rulers shared our resolve or our strategic vision. It expanded the theater of operations, certainly, demanding resources and attention. It was a necessary complication, a consequence of waging war against an island nation whose strength was its connection to the world through trade. The system was perhaps too ambitious for the means of enforcement then available, too reliant on the consistent will of disparate states. But the logic behind it remained sound. Strike at the source of the enemy's wealth, and you eventually strike at their power.
That focus on the unresolved rivalry with England, Your Excellency, despite the triumphs on the continent, brings us to the persistent challenge posed by their naval power. With direct invasion across the Channel proving exceptionally difficult due to the strength of the Royal Navy, the strategy shifted. It led to the implementation of the continental system, an attempt to cripple England economically by blocking their trade with the rest of Europe. From your perspective, What was the strategic thinking behind that immense undertaking? How was shutting off the continent intended to force England's hand? And what were the primary challenges you anticipated, and perhaps later encountered, in enforcing such a widespread blockade across so many nations?
Undermined? Certainly, the challenges you describe were considerable. The coastline of Europe is indeed vast, the temptation for illicit trade ever present. And yes, other nations, accustomed to the flow of English goods, chafed under the restrictions. Their treasuries, their merchants felt the strain. Their resentment, as you call it, was a predictable consequence of forcing them to sacrifice their immediate economic comfort for a larger strategic goal. Did it undermine the system's effectiveness against England? It made it harder, undeniably. It was not a swift, clean cut, but a slow, constant pressure. But it did bite. It caused significant distress in England, bankruptcies, social unrest. Their records, revealed later, confirm this. It was not a failure in inflicting pain, but perhaps a failure in delivering the decisive blow quickly enough. And yes, the effort to enforce it was a relentless task. Requiring vigilance, firmness, and yes, military presence where states were unwilling or unable to comply effectively. Portugal, for example, a traditional ally of England, its ports wide open to English ships. Such a gaping hole in the system could not be tolerated. Our demand was simple: close the ports, adhere to the system. Their refusal necessitated action. Spain, a complex matter. Weak leadership, internal divisions, their failure to secure their own borders effectively against English goods or influence. Yes, the need to ensure the system's integrity contributed directly to our interventions in those regions. The economic weapon required military teeth to enforce it across a continent where not all rulers shared our resolve or our strategic vision. It expanded the theater of operations, certainly, demanding resources and attention. It was a necessary complication, a consequence of waging war against an island nation whose strength was its connection to the world through trade. The system was perhaps too ambitious for the means of enforcement then available, too reliant on the consistent will of disparate states. But the logic behind it remained sound. Strike at the source of the enemy's wealth, and you eventually strike at their power.
That point about the economic weapon requiring military teeth to enforce it, Your Excellency, particularly in places like Portugal and Spain, it truly highlights the interconnectedness of your strategies and the unforeseen consequences that could arise. And indeed, the situation in the Iberian Peninsula, stemming significantly from the need to enforce the continental system, escalated into what became a long and brutal conflict, the Peninsular War. For the listeners, this often stands out as a particularly difficult and costly theater of operations for the empire. What was the initial strategic outlook on intervening in Portugal and then becoming embroiled in Spain? What were the expectations when your forces first entered that region? And what were the immediate challenges that perhaps differed from the campaigns you had fought elsewhere in Europe?
The Iberian Peninsula? Yes, the Spanish ulcer, as it would become. Initially, the strategic outlook was quite direct, Arthur. Portugal, as I mentioned, was a gaping hole in the continental system, an ally of England refusing to close its ports. This could not stand. Sending an army through Spain to compel Portugal's compliance seemed a necessary measure, a logical extension of the economic war against England. Spain itself, its monarchy was weak, decadent, riddled with internal strife. A kingdom in decline, unable to govern itself effectively or secure its own borders. There was an opportunity there, it seemed, to replace a weak, unreliable neighbor with a more stable, predictable entity tied to the interests of the empire, to secure the entire peninsula for the system, to deny England any foothold on the continent. The expectations were perhaps too simple. One expected resistance, certainly, but of the conventional sort. An army would march, fight a battle, secure the capital, negotiate terms, based on our experiences elsewhere in Europe. The challenges? Immediate and unlike those we had faced against the great armies of Austria or Prussia. The terrain is rugged, difficult for organized movement, favoring those who know its every contour. But the greatest challenge was the nature of the conflict itself. Not pitched battles between massed armies, but a constant, brutal, fragmented struggle. Guerrilla warfare. The entire population, stirred by priests and patriotism, seemed to rise against us. Every village a potential ambush, every road threatened. An enemy you could not see, that melted away after striking, that did not respect the conventional rules of engagement. They fought with a ferocity born of fanaticism and national pride. This was not fighting kings and cabinets. This was fighting a people. It drained resources, tied down vast numbers of troops in policing duties, eroded morale through constant harassment and cruelty on both sides. And then, of course, the English presence, landing forces under a commander, Wellesley Wellington, who proved competent and who understood how to exploit the terrain and support the local resistance. It was a theater where our usual methods of rapid, decisive campaigns were blunted by the very nature of the conflict and the land itself. A constant bleeding, a diversion of strength that should have been directed elsewhere. A harsh lesson.
That description of the Peninsular War, Your Excellency, the Spanish ulcer, the constant bleeding, the guerrilla warfare, the difficulty of applying your usual methods, it truly paints a picture of a unique and costly conflict. And you mentioned it was a diversion of strength that should have been directed elsewhere. It seems that while you were engaged in that difficult struggle in the Iberian Peninsula, tensions were also escalating significantly with another major power on the continent, Russia. The relationship, which had seemed strong after the Treaty of Tilsit, began to deteriorate. What were the key factors, from your perspective, that led to that breakdown in relations with Tsar Alexander I? And when did you begin to contemplate the possibility, or perhaps the necessity, of a confrontation with Russia, leading ultimately to the immense campaign of 1812?
Russia? Ah, yes, from the sands of Spain to the snows of the East. You correctly identify the diversion of strength. Every battalion tied down in that festering ulcer was a battalion unavailable for the greater strategic necessities. And the greatest of those necessities was addressing the wavering commitment of Tsar Alexander. Tilsit, in 1807, that was a moment of understanding, perhaps even potential amity. Two emperors dividing the world, or so it seemed. But alliances forged on shared ambition can be fragile when interests diverge. The key factors in the breakdown? Primary among them was the continental system. Russia, vast as it is, required trade, particularly with England. Adhering to the system inflicted hardship. It stirred discontent among their nobility, whose wealth was tied to exports. Alexander, under pressure, began to make exceptions, to look the other way, even to issue a new tariff that seemed aimed directly at French goods. This was unacceptable. The system was the weapon against England. Any breach weakened its effect, undermined our efforts. Beyond that, there were other points of friction. Russian expansionism, their moves in Finland, in the Balkans, encroaching upon areas we had agreed were beyond their immediate sphere. The matter of Poland, the creation of the Duchy of Warsaw, a necessary buffer, was perceived by the Tsar as a direct threat, a precursor to the resurrection of the old Polish kingdom, which would stand athwart his western border. His demands regarding this became insistent, and his character. Alexander was intelligent, but also susceptible to influence, prone to shifts in policy, perhaps not possessing the same clarity of will. One requires partners, not prevaricators. When did I contemplate confrontation? Not lightly, Arthur. Russia is immense, its distances vast, its resources in men formidable. But as the breaches in the system became more blatant, as the Tsar's demands grew, as it became clear he was not a reliable partner against England, the necessity became inescapable. A breach in the continental system of that magnitude, left unaddressed, would unravel the entire strategy. It would embolden England, demonstrate our inability to enforce our will even on an ally. Around 1811, it became evident that the path led towards war. A final, decisive confrontation was required to bring Russia back into line, to secure the system, to demonstrate the consequences of defying the empire. It was not a desirable prospect, but a strategic imperative dictated by the Tsar's actions and the larger struggle against England. The scale of the army assembled for 1812 reflected the scale of the challenge.